Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I understand why it's important for flood insurance rates to reflect the real risks and the costs of flood damage. I get this. And I understand why we want our flood maps to represent the best scientific data available, including the latest evidence of climate change. And over time, I agree that it makes sense for us to move to a market-based system for setting flood insurance rates, provided we adequately take into account affordability concerns for low-income families. I get this. I have more trouble understanding, though, why it's made sense for FEMA to implement various new rules at the same time that they're updating the flood insurance maps. When FEMA put out the new flood maps this year and last year, they placed hundreds of thousands of homeowners into a flood zone for the very first time. And so now there are thousands of people in Massachusetts, thousands of homeowners, who are suddenly being asked to pay thousands of dollars in premiums that they had never been asked to pay before. And many of these homeowners are dealing with new and unexpected costs. Many have no good options available to them. One Massachusetts resident wrote to me and said, I'm 70 years old, I live on a fixed income, and I'm unable to pay the proposed flood insurance. That constituent and many others have said they don't know what to do. So I'm here today. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to hear from Senator Landrieu, to hear from Senator Vitter, to hear from my colleagues and others who will be here to testify. I think we all know where we're trying to get, but I think there's a question about the path getting there. So thank you very much for being here. So, Mr. Fugate, I just want to go back and make sure I understand this. What kind of outreach did FEMA do before it released the new maps, or as it was releasing the new maps, to tell homeowners who'd never before been in flood zones that now they were going to end up in flood zones?
Well, community by community, when we go in to update maps, and there's usually either we have a map that's old, that we have new data, we have been requested by the community, or we've had a disaster, and disasters have been prioritized in a lot of that. We start our conversations with the community itself, the government that's responsible for that jurisdiction. This process is actually a several-year process that we start with them. We get the best available.
So you talk to the mayors. I just want to make sure I'm following. You talk to the mayors. You talk to the county officials.
Yes, ma'am. We send the notifications. Oftentimes, the people we're working with are the public works, utilities, or whoever the land use management agency is. And then we work with them in developing the scoping of the maps, the areas we're going to look at to update, any additional concerns they have. If they have data or newer data, FEMA contracts with engineering firms to then update those maps. We do a series of preliminary maps. You may hear the term a pre-firm, a pre-flood insurance rate map, that we then go back to the community. They do notices. Oftentimes, though, this process, even though there's public notices and there's outreach, most people don't pay too much attention to it until they see that their status has changed. That's why we do the hearings. We provide that opportunity. At that point, if new information is given, we're able to take a look at that. We've had several where we've issued pre-firms. Members of the communities have questioned the data. We've got new data. This process can take 2 to 3 years. Then the community has to, the local officials, to make the maps official. FEMA cannot make the maps official, but to make them enforceable, the local government has to vote to adopt the maps as part of their ordinance.
So let me follow up to make sure then that I'm tracking on this. So when someone discovers then that they're now, because of the map, they're now in a flood zone, they had not been in a flood zone before, I understand that there's an appeals process.
Yes, ma'am.
For that, can you tell me how many people have appealed their status in a flood zone? Do we know yet? Do we have any idea?
I would have to respond for the record for that. I know it's in the hundreds, if not thousands. But I would have to go back because we do so many maps across the country, and they're in all phases of production. Some are preliminary, some have already been in the pre-firm. But pre-firm is usually when the public first gets their look at the maps. And one of the things that we used to do was it was always on paper, so you had to go somewhere to see it. So we've been working to get these out online as digital layers so people can go look up and get information easier to see that information and then make determinations about is there anything that they need to do or want to do about that information.
So maybe I should have asked this the other way to get the base rate. how many homeowners have been affected by moving from not in a flood zone to in a flood zone? Do you have some sense? Or have had their status changed because they're...
Oh, it is substantial, and it goes both ways.
Substantial as in?
Thousands. And I would have to, it depends upon maps. Some maps had good data, so you don't see big changes. Others are more substantial. We know, I can show you that in New York and New Jersey, post Sandy, that we had already been doing maps prior to Sandy. And so in using that data, it has increased the flood risk in those areas. The maps display the risk. And so as we went through, we were actually mapping those areas and updating maps prior to Sandy. But there were substantial changes. So it is impacting how and where people rebuild. It's also affecting decisions local officials are making about where they want to buy out or apply mitigation dollars.
That surprises me, though, that you would say it's thousands. I would think it would be far more homeowners than that. But let me ask, in the appeals process, for someone to take an appeal, I had heard from someone in Massachusetts about this, someone in Brockton who was told that if she wanted to take an appeal, the only way she could do it was to pay more than $1,000 to an engineer to come in and do an elevation study of a nearby brook, even though the city of Brockton and the Army Corps of Engineers have no record of the brook ever overflowing at any time in history. So the question I have is, for a homeowner to take an appeal, if they have to take on a cost like this, does that really give them an effective tool if they think that they should not be rated as in a flood zone?
Well, there's two parts to that. The first piece is, unfortunately, the program does not have the money to pay for the elevation certificates, and that's what determines that. The second piece is, I've been all over the country, and no disrespect, Senator, I've been in many places that have never flooded before until it's declared as a disaster. So we look at the basins, we look at the topography, we look at the risk, and we're dealing with risk of 100-year and 500-year risk in calculating these flood tables. So it's not uncommon to go into areas that have not had recent flooding, because quite fortunately that's not the case in many places. But if you do have that rainfall event or that storm event, their risk would fall greater than 1%, which is the special flood risk area. But if we can get the elevation and say you're 1 foot above that, then that would move you back into a much better category of risk and would make the insurance much more affordable.
Good. Well, I have some more questions about the process. I want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry we ran over.